First and foremost, thank you to the Maharashtra Ophthalmic Society for having me here. Just a little word for Dr. Sumit Lane, who's been so fabulous in organizing everything. He keeps at you till you are ready and giving the talk. So thank you, Sumit. Um, this is going to be a rapid talk. It's transconjunctival orbital floor repair with biocompatible implants. So I basically use this to repair all my orbital floor fractures, an entity which most people kind of tend to ignore or leave out. And because the cases are not, at least in private practice in Mumbai, they're not primarily, uh, kind of referred to us, they're referred to other people, trauma surgeons, etc. And all this is always missed, and it comes back with horrific complications. Just because I deal with strabismus and I deal with paralytic strabismus, they actually come back to me with very severe inferior rectus scarring, unable to read, and it's a pity that these things get missed. So an anatomical review is that the orbit is made up mainly of the zygomatic palatine. The floor of the orbit mainly made of zygomatic palatine and the maxillary bones. And the floor extends 35 to 40 millimeters. So people who are starting should have a ruler which is sterilized along with the kit, with our instruments. And always remember the branch of the inferior maxillary artery. This is, of course, the floor. It's deficient in one part and complete in the other. And the medial part is the part which technically fractures, and the vessels going through the floor. So you have to be careful that you don't go too deep beyond 35 millimeters, because if you touch this, the patient will probably bleed terribly and will not be able to manage it in our settings. So a lot of theories on how and when to repair. A lot of people empirically repair it, and the theory of inferior orbital fat pad, which is just under the inferior rectus muscle, is the most common theory which is now accepted. It's not the muscle which collapses, but the fat pad which goes in, and the whole complex then scars down, and that's why you start getting the diplopia and the scarring in the inferior rectus muscle. So indications which were previous, I'll show you some newer indications also. More than 2 millimeters of enophthalmos, greater than 50% of the floor loss, or intraorbital nerve hypesthesia. This actually is the hypesthesia is very, very troubling to the patient, and a lot of patients just come in for surgery even with hypesthesia, but a lot of it is not doesn't come back. So be aware and be careful. The coronal views are the best views to kind of gauge how much is the fracture, whether there is any prolapse. If you can explain to the patient, it's easy to motivate and mobilize the patient also. If you show him this aspect of your CT scan, and the CT is obviously the CT study is the investigation of choice when you are suspecting a floor fracture. I routinely also do a force duction, a force generation, and normally inside a 3-week repair would be the way to go for this. So we did a prospective study of 11 patients. This was about a year back, pre-COVID. Obviously, in COVID, we didn't have, and we suddenly lost all the floor fractures because there were no accidents and no one was there on the road. We fixed them all transconjunctivally with Medport plates. We had a 1-year follow-up with them. There were no complications and no extrusions. With a positive p-value of 87%, we had motility restoration. The ones which came to me were quite bad. I'll show you the photographs. And the Hertel restoration of about 104%. So pre-op, obviously, medical fitness, a full eye check, a Hertel check, and a CT scan is mandatory. Repair options: titanium, sialistic plates, bone, cartilage. I prefer the Medport plates. It's simpler to slide in and much easier to use. These are the Medport plates. This is the back side of the Medport plate. The front side, which has the smooth area, which actually goes under the muscle, so the muscle doesn't scar and stick. And I directly take an incision. Of course, I do it with a cutting cautery and directly onto the first one incision on the conjunctiva. The conjunctiva is retracted up, then directly onto the rim and open the rim and raise the whole thing and put the plate in. So post-operatively, increasing proptosis, vomiting, IOP, increase wound dehiscence, infection and extrusion are obviously what we need to watch for. I just give a local anesthesia. I don't actually give any, I have an anesthetist standby, but I don't give any sedation. And an ice pack post-operatively is very, very mandatory, and it works wonderfully. And the patient goes on very happy. Now, the late complications are the ones that we should be discussing also, because the standard ones, most ophthalmic plastic surgeons are now quite familiar at operating and doing. The diplopia is the problem. So what will you do if the patient already has diplopia, which is visually debilitating? And these are the ones which actually come late. So the options are a Medport plate plus inferior rectus recession with Botox, a NAP procedure where you combine the medial and the lateral along with the superior rectus, and a bilateral inferior rectus recession. So if you get a positive force duction, that means you obviously, if the force duction is positive, the muscle is entrapped or is scarred, and a positive force generation, that means the inferior rectus is still working, it has enough power. You recess the inferior rectus to allow the globe to elevate beyond the midline. Anything more than 5 millimeters will require a combined NAP and a disattachment of the inferior rectus, otherwise you'll get lid recession. And I almost always now give Botox for such patients because they have wonderful results. I'll be done in a second. A positive force duction and a negative force generation. You recess the inferior rectus as before, recess the inferior rectus bilaterally, and also combine it with a NAP procedure. Again, Botox early late is debatable. I always give Botox in the scar inferior rectus muscle. So it's a safe procedure, fast and cosmetically viable. If the incision is protected by the periosteum, septum, and the conjunctiva, so it's more protected. And the Medport plate is easy to acquire with less muscle to plate scarring. Thank you. So these are some of the photographs. Large, very rewarding procedure, folks, and very quick and easy to do.
Wonderful, sir. Great work.
Now, how do I exit out of this here?
That's a leave button down.
Leave is I'll leave the chat, right?
Just stop sharing.
Stop sharing.
All right.
So I think next speaker, Dr. Vidya Shankar, you can start sharing your screen, sir. I'll invite you for the next talk.
Can you see it, madam?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The screen is visible. You can put it on slideshow mode.
All right. So we are going to be talking on medial canthal trauma management. This is definitely a very vast subject. I'm quite sure that Dr. Das is going to do great justice and help me out in the nasal trauma also, which would also involve some of the management issues. So when we are talking about medial canthal, this is all that we are going to be talking on. We are going to be talking about the canthal ligament. We are going to be talking on the crura and all the bones, fat, arteries, nerves, the canthal attachments and things like that. This is the canthal tendon. The canthal tendon injuries would be basically of 3 types. First 2 are without the fracture segments moving out. And the third one is where the MCT is also going to be detached. So when we evaluate a patient, though it may be looking so bad, digital photography is something that you would want to have always. So that right now for the medical legal issues as well. So when we are doing this canthal reattachment and things like that, the most important thing is in the first 48 hours. In first 48 hours, you know that the vision-threatening syndromes like retrobulbar hemorrhage and persistent bleeding is there. So in such cases, you would want to try and decompress or reduce the compressed windows as fast as possible. So the approaches would be the surgery could be a transconjunctival, transcanalicular, the medial canthal, or the bifrontal, which sometimes the neurosurgeons would go with. The medial canthal avulsions is, if you see over here, if you see over here, this is completely avulsed. And we are looking at the crura, the two ends of the crura, the upper and the lower limbs, and that we are going to try and osseate it to the periorbita over here. The suture that we are going to be using is, many times we make mistakes at that. This suture should be a permanent suture. So that's why we are going to be taking a Prolene. Many people would probably take a Vicryl. Vicryl will start becoming loose with time, and then the laxity will soon follow. So if you are going to be suturing it, we suture it with Prolene. And basically the canthus, we are going to be putting it back in its position, if that is all that is going to be repaired. But many times this is going to be involved along with the canaliculus. So if it is the canaliculus, then the canaliculus is going to be taken first, and then we are going to be suturing both the upper and the lower crura back into position. So that is how we basically do. So over here, you can see that though the lid has been completely avulsed, if it is going to be put back in time and in its place, then you will get a very good cosmesis. Many times the canthal displacements would give rise to soft tissue deformities as well as a telecanthus. And in such cases, you may want to take care of the soft tissue first and then the canthal repositionings. So this is just going back to the same slide, in slide work as far as the video is concerned. But if you are going to have a position like this, where preoperative photo, you are seeing a huge telecanthus. So in this telecanthus, if you are going to be doing a YV-plasty or a mustardase, then you will be able to put them back in its position. Once the soft tissue is put, then we can always go in the same or the next thing, the canaliculus injuries also. So when we are talking about canalicular injury, which is one of the more important and easier ways to look at, this canalicular injuries could be a direct, where it's dog bite, or it could be indirect because of the hit against the bone. Why do we need to? It would be like this. Okay. So in an occult tear, in the small child, you are actually not seeing the tear unless you look at it closely. And in such cases, you would need to put in a probe. You could use either a pigtail, you could use a monocanalicular, or you could use, in some of the cases where a monocanalicular was not available, we have used even an angiocath. So I'm just going to show you a video over here. So in this video, you are seeing that there is a two ways this lower lid has been cut. So you have this opening which is there. I'm just making it a little larger so that it will let my angiocath in, and then the more medial end of it will go through it, and the soft tissue is being sutured into position. Once the soft tissue is sutured into position, then the remaining of the lid can be sutured. It is always going to be sutured in layers. The skin is going to be sutured with non-dissolvable, and the conjunctiva and the tarsus, you could suture it with Vicryl. So Vicryl is generally to be avoided on the skin because it is multifilament and it can give rise to a lot of granuloma. But of course, if you are planning to take it off and you don't require it to be there for a very long time, then you can, and especially in children, then you could probably go with it in children, because then you don't require an anesthesia to be given again. This is a very clean cut of the canaliculus. Just one position it has been cut, and this position is identified. You can use air. You can just inject air so that the bubble will help you to find out where the end is. Some people use methylene blue. Some people use visco with a little bit of a dye, either methylene blue or your fluorescent. So here, if you are going to look at it again, I will share with this video again, because this is something which I think quite a few people can attempt it if it is going to be seen in that. First, a dilatation of the punctum. You put a probe to cannulate it, and the other end, the more medial end of the cut end. you can just, because by the time you take up for surgery, there may be a membrane or some adhesions there. So you open up the punctum, and this is the monocanalular stent that can be utilized. If in case monocanalular is not used, you can use an angiocath, or you can still use a little tougher, or 1-0 or a 0-0 proline can also be used. The last part of putting in the monocanalular stent is when you will straighten it up. It is always at an angle with the rest of the tube. So the last part is very important because you need to hitch it. Otherwise, with any Valsalva movements, easing and things like that, you can have a dislocation of the stent. You can even stitch it in place by a Vicryl, 8-0 or 6-0 Vicryl. In such cases, you use with the use of monocanalular as well as bicanalular, the rates of this is very good. All the post-operative treatments are almost the same as the rest. The goal is throughout a good evaluation, individualized surgical plan. We should know our limitations and at the same time try and give the patient as good prosthesis as possible. Thank you for a patient listening. I thank BOA, MOS, and our colleague and friend Sumit, and welcome the other guests also to this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful reckoner on the medial canthal trauma management. So next, I would like to invite Dr. Mariam Pauli for her talk. And ma'am, if you could just share your presentation, please.
Welcome, Mariam.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I think.
Your slides are visible. You just put
Yeah,
it on
I was making it.
slideshow. Yeah.
I think everybody are in their clinics only, most of them.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, hi. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Yeah. Thank you, MOS, for giving me this great opportunity. Today, I'm speaking about approach to pediatric epiphora. We are coming across pediatric patients coming with watering every day in our OPD. So what are the goals of our evaluation? Basically, we have to distinguish between affirmation and epiphora, define the pathological process responsible for tearing, again distinguish between anatomical and functional disorders, and then finally evaluate the block if it is located and extend and define a treatment approach. So we know epiphora is decreased due to decreased tear outflow, whereas lacrimation is tear overproduction. As already mentioned, it can be either anatomical or functional. So what are the key points? We know in pediatric patients, basically parents has to give the history. So whether always ask whether it is constant or intermittent, is it associated with any upper respiratory infection, and age of onset. This is very, very important to differentiate between congenital and acquired disorders. Especially when the kid presents at 4 years of age with watering, you have to always ask whether it is present since birth or it is present after some time. Then any history of ocular itching or mucus to rule out allergic conjunctivitis. Then history of any ocular trauma, history of blepharospasm, then history of glaucoma or any sinus surgery, especially in pediatric patients, adenoid, history of adenoids, and any systemic disorders. Again, prior facial palsy, then history of nocturnal agophthalmos. This is very, very important. Some kids will say they will have watering in the morning, then they will improve. So history of nocturnal agophthalmos, then any history of altered bone growth that rules out fibrous dysplasia. So how will you practically approach a patient? Look at the tear meniscus height. This is just a good morning or good afternoon examination. When the child presents to your room, just look at the child and let's say hi. Then you know whether the tear meniscus height is high or normal or whatever it is. And if the child is cooperative, examine under slit lamp. Then check for Roplas. You know whether it is, if it is positive, look for whether it is watery, mucoid or mucopurulent. Then this is the one key test, that is dye disappearance test. Fluorescein is inserted into the unanesthetized lower fornix. Ask the child to wait outside for 5 minutes. Then check the thickness of the fluorescein tear meniscus. Ideally, it has to be measured with cobalt blue filter and all, but most of the time it is not practically possible in our routine OPD. So this is a child where you can see the raised tear film height that shows there is a delay in the disappearance of the dye. If fluorescent is draining but increased tear meniscus height, look for lacrimation. So where is the site of lacrimation? Whether it is lacrimal gland or lids. If it is lids, MGD, it is very rare, but still sometimes, especially kids and teenage group, can have oily secretions at the root of the lashes. Then rule out any ocular surface problems. So these are few pictures. They just presented with the water. You can see the child sleeps. There is nocturnal lag ophthalmos. So this is basically he had facial cleft. So there is a decreased height of the lids causing lag ophthalmos, and this will improve with the small tarsography. So this is another child. You can see a small lesion in the face. This was actually a molluscum. So this was a clue to the child's watering. So when we examined the lid, there was a very small molluscum near the one of the lash. So this is another child again present with the watering. When we examined, he had dacryoadenitis. So examination of the adnexa is very, very important. Then if the dye disappearance is delayed, then look for the site of delayed clearance. Lid, punctum, canaliculus, sac, NLD, nose. Coming to the lid. So this child presents with watering. So now you can see there is a lower lid retraction in the right eye. And when we look at the examination of the face, the child is having a facial palsy and he has got lag ophthalmos. So when you go back to the history, the mother gives history of facial palsy. So that is the pathology behind the watering. Then Centurion syndrome, it is also seen in around teenage. It is due to the anterior displacement of medial candle tendon. We know the normal site of it should be in opposition to the globe punctum. But in medial candle tendon, the punctum is off the globe. It is due to prominent nasal bridge. This is also a good morning or good afternoon diagnosis. When you look at the teenager's face, you know. Now coming to the syringing, this might not be possible in all the pediatric patients, but in little bit adult towards teenage or around 10 years of age, most of the time they allow syringing. I'm not going into the details. If there is regurgitation, look for whether it is immediate or delayed. Sometimes after conjunctivitis, you can get a canalicular block. So that rules out the NLD, and syringing is also important in especially cases of pediatric epiphora. So once syringing is done, then the next is probing. This is to differentiate hard stop and soft stop. This is also possible, especially in kids more than 8 years of age in your OPD itself. Then punctum is examined under slit lamp. Look for size, patent. Role of radiology is little limited, especially in pediatric cases, but especially post-trauma when the kid presents with watering, especially following facial-maxillary injuries, this might help. Then role of imaging, especially in this child presents with watering. He's 13 years of age. So if you look at it, you can see a small telecanthus in the left eye. Syringing showed common canalicular block. So when we did a CT scan, you can see the fibrous dysplasia involving the ethmoid, displacing the sac and canaliculus. So sometimes radiology also will give a clue to your diagnosis. Finally, nasal examination and endoscopy to rule out mucosal abnormalities, turbinates, and septa. Lacrimal fistula is one common condition which we come across. It is managed in symptomatic patients. Either you can do a simple cautery or simple closure of the fistula. Congenital dacrocystosing presents like this, blue or pink swelling, can be associated with distal obstruction plus or minus proximal obstruction. Coming to the NLDO, NLDO is a great mimicker. So in this, we can see there is a mass in the medial candle. This is above the medial candle tendon. This is below. So this was a case of dermolysis. This is lacrimal abscess secondary to nasal lacrimal obstruction. So when you see NLDO, rule out the syndromic associations also, which is depicted in this slide. Massage, I'm not going into the details. Then probing after 12 months. Earlier, if you're planning an intraocular vesicle or recurrent cellulitis, repeat probing after 3 months if the initial probing fails. You can do infracture of inferior turbinate in the repeat probing. DCR at 4 years of age, switch to the posterior flap also. So I will end up with a small clinical scenario. 4-year-old child presented with a recurrent abscess. IND done 4 times in the past. Probing was done 3 times. Patency was proved. Patient was not willing for DCG. It was a case of lacrimal sac fistula, which we excised and did the intubation and did well. So this is in short regarding the approach to pediatric epiphora, and we have to rule out, or we have to do a complete ophthalmic examination to rule out all fundus problems and tumors, glaucoma in a case of pediatric epiphora. Thank you.
Short, sweet, extensive, comprehensive.
Yeah, thank you. I will stop.
We have Dr. Sunil. Sunil requires no introduction. Dr. Sunil Morikar. Dr. Sunil Morikar is going to be talking on precision medicine in pediatric ophthalmology. Dr. Morikar, are you there?
He's there in the participant.
Yeah.
I'm there.
Yeah, there.
I'm having a little trouble with this thing. Can you see me? Can you see?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll share my screen. Just give me a minute.
Can you share your screen, please?
Can you see my screen?
No, not started yet. I can see
Can you
you
see my
on the
screen?
screen. Yeah, now it's coming.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, you can go ahead, sir.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about a little offbeat.
Can you
topic
take
here.
your mask off, please? We'll be able to hear better.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So we're going to. I'm going to talk about a little offbeat thing here. It's personalized medicine and artificial intelligence. It's a combination of two directly opposite things. When we talk about personalized medicine, we are talking about one person and customized medicine for him. Whereas when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we are clubbing everything together. So there's no conflict of interest here, but this is something that we have been working for quite some time. So we know the clinical effectiveness of healthcare quality can be assessed through clinical audit of genomic and AI applications. So what we've tried to do is we have tried to look at that in our cases. 10 million children are affected by rare diseases with genetic etiology. That's already been said by Ferreira and all. What is known that the introduction of genetic testing largely via disease areas have been successful at clarifying disease. And it is now a timely and cost-effective investigation that should be elemental to the assessment of inherited diseases. Genetic testing is in an opportune fashion permits genetic counseling, enables families to make decisions. Not only reproductive decisions, now we are talking about even surgical decisions, even treatment management decisions. So what is unknown, whether it actually has an impact at the real world grassroots. This is such a topic in which a randomized control trial is not possible. So you want to look at what is the grassroots data and whether what implementation can be done. There are audits are missing in literature. So we tried to do an audit. We've done an audit over 10 years across 12 centers, pediatric eye diseases. I'm talking in an oculoplasty session because most of these are pediatric oculoplasty diseases, though we call it pediatric ophthalmology. What we did is we applied covariates such as autosomal recessive inheritance, consanguinity, ethnicity, and these are all assessed using the Fisher's exact. We have looked at data of 25,495 patients. This has come from a vast number of cases, so it's not just me alone, there are other people also. We've looked at cryptophthalmus as an example, a complete cryptophthalmus versus an incomplete cryptophthalmus like this other one. Or we have seen various subtypes of cryptophthalmus, and we know that the FREM2 gene can cause a syndromic form of cryptophthalmus, and we would want to know whether there would be expected a subglottic stenosis. So there are times in the past when I have taken up the patient for surgery, and then the anesthetist has told me, sir, there is subglottic stenosis and we cannot go ahead. No? So this can be something which can be found out by a pre-treatment or a pre-surgical genomic medicine or genetic analysis. There's a very common condition which generally gets missed out. So I had a family which came with hereditary dacrocystitis. मेरे परदादा को था, मेरे दादा को था, मेरे father को था और मुझे भी है. And this kind of hereditary dacrocystitis is sometimes inherited, and this is not something which is spoken about in literature as well. It is called as osteopoikilosis, where the bones are very thick and the mutations in the LMD3 and the EXT1 genes are what are responsible for dacrocystitis running in families. When you look for it, if I don't know about it, I may not find it. When I look for it, I found 4 different families with this over a period of 12 years. So this is something that I would look for. There are other conditions like Down syndrome, CHARG syndrome, autosomal recessive disorders, cataracts, because I have included them in the pediatric ophthalmology as well. Clefting syndromes, a lot of clefting syndromes we have seen. We've realized that ancestry and consanguinity are the most important factors. So what I would say that what I have learned from this, I would implement in my treatment chart, is that whenever I'm looking at a pediatric oculoplasty case, I would like to build an ancestry chart, and consanguinity is something which invariably comes up here. The AI applications were when I see a particular patient and I see the faces of the patient, the face of the patient. So there was a time when we said Hansen's faces or leprotic faces, which are leonine faces. So is it possible that we can take pictures of these patients and then put them into a already available database and look at the phenotype, what is being expressed, and try to find out what the genotype, so that you don't waste the patient's money in terms of genetic analysis. So this is something that we explored. And the list of artificial intelligence and machine learning based methods used in rare diseases, these are the things which are available, the softwares which are available already. You can log on to any of these and you can find out a lot of data on that, and then you can compare that data with your patients. So your pediatric oculoplasty becomes a little better. That's the second part of it. So there are a lot of these things which are available for different diseases. So you find your patient and which AI will fit in, machine learning will fit in, and you can put in your patient and find out more data. On the basis of this data, so there are times when people have told me, find out Kia, we found out that there is a problem. What do we do further with it? So the decision tree and the decision support systems are also available online. So you can get into this, and we need to now get into putting this AI, what is available. So there's a rare disease, let's say there is cryptophthalmus, but there is a lot of data available about cryptophthalmus. Fraser syndrome, a lot of data available there. So people have collimated those data. We need to put our patient in there and find out what is going to happen in our patient, and then give the patient precision medicine. So it's not diametrically opposite things. We know that you take raw data and you put it into a harmonized. So there are variants you find out, the gene filters you find out, and then the most important thing is consenting, the blood collection, and then you do the CLI sequencing, and you put it either into a clinical information or into a research, and then you do genomic learning, and you come back again genomic learning with AI. So the phenotype and the genotype are important. So analysis of the genomic data benefits from access to phenomic information. We phenotype participants using an automated and manual program drawing from the EHR and the result data. So for example, this is a patient with claw, foot, and beak nose. So this could be any of the following things. It could be a Hallermann-Streiff syndrome, a Crouzon syndrome, Ellis-Van-Creveld, fibroplasia. So we do the genetic analysis of this patient, and you find out that there's a CDH3 related retinal dystrophy which is associated with this patient, and you find out that we were concentrating on the patient with the oculoplastic point of view. There was a retinal thing which was also there, and you could do an early rehabilitation. Again, a patient with eyelid retraction, and we found out that this is a patient of thyroid. Optic nerve gliomas, we know that the STD2 mutation is associated with aggressive growth, and when you find this mutation, you want to do something with this patient. Otherwise, most of the times I end up telling the patient, let's wait and watch. The BRAF mutations are common. We have neurofibromas. Again, we've used a lot of genetic material there. Absent sphenoid wing is something that you can see the pulsations there. So this is something that in a particular patient we found out on table in a rural area where we were operating, and we didn't have data before that. But what is important is that absent sphenoid wing can also be present in the absence of neurofibromatosis. So has to be looked at. The results, we had a specificity of 87 and 89%. Currently, only 5% of the rare diseases have a treatment. And our results, we had an effect in 24%. And so, in short, in conclusion, any planning in pediatric ophthalmology, pediatric oculoplasty in a deprived, ethnically diverse area like the twin city of Mumbai and Navi Mumbai has been aided by use of epidemiological and genetic and audit data, and has a measurable impact in this. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil. Wonderful presentation. Dr. Nupur is going to be talking to us on facial spasms and how to simplify that. She's going to simplify it for all of us.
Yeah.
Dr. Nupur.
So I hope my slides are visible and in the slideshow.
Yes.
Yeah, hi.
Yes.
So a very good afternoon, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank MOSCON, Sumit, Dr. Ragini for giving me the opportunity to share the podium with stalwarts and, present. So my talk is facial spasm simplified. So before I start, certain acknowledgements to Dr. Milind Nayak, Dr. Gayatri, and the LV Prasad Eye Institute PAVU team for the videos and the photos. So the outline would be discussing on the normal anatomy and physiology, differentials of facial spasm, then elaborating on the ones which are treatable, hemifacial spasm, benign central blepharospasm, Meeks syndrome, and followed by a quick retinal overview of Botox injection in these conditions. So why do we really need to know about facial twitch? Because it's a form of social embarrassment and it affects the quality of life. So a quick photograph depicting the various facial muscles that can be involved in the facial spasms and the twitch. Any of those can be involved. A normal blink can be either a simple blink, which is an involuntary blink with gentle touching of the upper eyelid to the lower eyelid. This is used for the normal lubrication. There's the another blink, which is the tonic blink. It's the most forceful and animated muscular contracture. This is the one which is responsible for keeping the irritative substances out, and it is associated with the downward movement of the eyebrow. So it is when the frequency of this tonic blinking actually increases and the relaxation phase is prolonged. This is called the eyelid twitch. So the eyelid twitch, a patient comes, so there can be a lot of reasons on history one should try to rule out before, really, so it could be anything: excessive caffeine, certain medications, dry eye, allergy, smoking, alcohol consumption. So a psychogenic facial spasm needs to be differentiated from the ones that can be treated. So the movements in a psychogenic facial spasm, they are non-patterned, they vary in frequency and intensity and are distractible, and it can involve the face and any body region. The ones which are of concern to are the primarily hemifacial spasm, the benign essential blepharospasm, Meeks syndrome. So I'll be discussing them in detail and how these are the ones I would be really focusing on, because this is what would require treatment. So a quick video. So how do you differentiate facial spasms? You draw a midline, draw a vertical midline and a horizontal midline. So if the upper 1/4 part of the face is involved, it's the orbicularis myokainia, as you can see in this. Then if the face is involved along the vertical half of the midline, it's the hemifacial spasm. As you can see, just the vertical half of the face is involved. And if the face above the horizontal midline is involved, which is the IPAB, this is the benign essential blepharospasm, as you can see. And benign essential blepharospasm involving the entire lower half of the face associated with pursing of lips. This is what we call as the Meeks syndrome. So coming to a very quick overview again, orbicularis myokainia, as discussed, it involves the 1/4 upper face. And so first you would try for a stress reduction, but it may require a focal botulinum toxin injection into the involved muscle bundle. Hemifacial spasm, orbicularis myokainia is generally seen in younger individuals. Hemifacial spasm is seen in the middle aged, generally in females. And it can also be associated with low-pitched tinnitus because of the seventh nerve involvement, and symptoms tend to persist during sleep. The initial site is generally the orbicularis oculi muscle in most of the cases, cheek in 11% and periodal region in 10%. One thing I would like to stress upon is the Babinski sign, because the hemifacial spasm can be bilateral. It's generally asynchronous. So in hemifacial spasm, In a bilateral hemifacial spasm, the ipsilateral brow will elevate during contracture. This you note when you have a benign essential blepharospasm. I'll be discussing in the subsequent slide. Spontaneous resolution is known to occur, but in less than 10% of the patients. This is very important. The possible etiology is that this can have a CNS etiology in the form of an ectatic cranial vasculature pressing on the 7th nerve or an intracranial mass. So if you see a hemifacial spasm, one must request for a baseline neuroimaging. So hemifacial spasm, the treatment options are, if you do a neuroimaging and then you really point out the root cause, then the neurosurgical microvascular decompression is the treatment to go. You need to cure it, but it does have a risk of permanent facial nerve injury. The mainstay of treatment in an idiopathic case remains Botox injection. The only drawback is that you need to explain to the patient that the injection needs to be repeated. It's not a permanent cure, but symptomatic improvement is seen in 95% of the patients. Certain oral medications can also be tried. Coming to benign essential blepharospasm, so it was depicted as early as in 16th century through this painting called Dickefer, which is believed to be depicting benign essential blepharospasm. So only 20% have isolated blepharospasm. It generally has a bigger spectrum. So this is isolated blepharospasm. If it involves the lower face, this is the Meek syndrome. If it involves the neck muscle, becomes the Bruegel syndrome. It can be a generalized, it can be a cranial dystonia or the entire body. So again, it presents in the 4 to 6 decades. So just concentrate on this Charcot sign. In a benign essential blepharospasm, the eyebrows are pulled down towards the midline, whereas we discussed in a hemifacial spasm, the eyebrows are elevated. So this we can use this. It's a self-stimulating circuit which results in benign essential blepharospasm. Treatment, again, you can give CNS depressants. Again, Botox works very well. A quick reckoner table of differentiation between these three conditions. Just for the sake of completion, there is also a condition called as apraxia of lid opening, and this can be associated with blepharospasm. It is characterized by difficulty in initiating the active lid elevation, aberrant regeneration of the facial nerve. So it can be in the form of crocodile tears, Frey syndrome, gustatory sweating, or abnormal facial movements. Meek syndrome, as I said, that involving the full face with the pursing of lips between the jaw movements. So coming to the treatment aspect, so botulinum toxin, we all know is an exotoxin which is produced by Clostridium botulinum. So there are 8 antigenically distinguishable exotoxins. So type A is the most potent, followed by B. The commercial preparations which are available are, for type A, you have Botox at Dysport, Myoblock, and to know that Botox is 50 to 100 times more potent than Myoblock. There's a newer type A formulation for Botox A without the protein content. This is Xeomin NT. And certain contraindication one must be aware before offering the Botox. If the patient is pregnant, any peripheral motor neuropathic disease like ALS, myasthenia gravis, one should avoid offering. So the reconstitution of Botox is equally important. The diluent used is a normal saline, and I generally prefer taking 2.5 units per 0.1 ml. So depending on what constitution you have, 50 units or 100 units vial, that much amount of normal saline you would take in a syringe. You would slowly inject the tip of the needle into the Botox vial. Do not push it because the vacuum itself is sufficient. Avoid any frothing. And then gently mix the Botox with diluent by rotating the vial. The Botox molecules are very delicate, so one needs to be very careful while reconstituting. And once you have reconstituted solution, just take it in a 1 ml or a tuberculin syringe, and then you can attach a 29 or 30 gauge needle for toxin injection. The reconstituted toxin can be kept in the side door of the fridge, which is 4 degrees Celsius. It is not to be kept in the freezer. This point is very important. And the reconstituted solution should be clear, colorless, free of any particulate matter, and should be stored in a refrigerator. So the normal for orbicularis myocamia, probably a 15 units would be good enough. For hemifacial spasms, 25 units. Benign essential blepharospasm, 30 to 40 units. And for Meek syndrome, probably 50 units would be a good. So the general sites, the thing that I would like to stress upon, that injecting in the preseptal muscle, orbicularis muscle is better than injecting in the pretarsal. And obviously the brow, you need to give it more. You need to pinch and then give it more. For the hemifacial spasm, the sites, and the complications that can occur can lead to ptosis, lag of ophthalmos, ectropion, diplopia, any hematoma. So that needs to be explained to the patient. So the take-home message, very quickly, I would just sum up that it's important to know what kind of spasm you're dealing with. For the HFS, you need to go for a neuroimaging. A quick again reckoner for you how to differentiate between the different kinds of facial spasms. And again, with respect to Botox, it's a temporary but effective treatment. It is important to be aware of the appropriate dosage, reconstitution technique, and to maximize the effect. So thank you so much. You're on mute, sir.
Sorry for that. Wonderful, Dr. Nupur. Great job. Dr. Das is a very, very well-known person as far as oculoplasty faculty is concerned. Dr. Das is going to be talking to us on adnexal trauma management.
Yeah.
Dr.
Hello,
Das.
everyone. Hello, Vidyasankar. Hello, Nupur. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm just sharing my slide. So, is it visible?
Yeah, it's come on.
Okay. So that is management of complex orbital trauma. Dr. Vidyasankar already mentioned some part. So I will talk, it will be very easy for me to next, I will go little faster. So in such cases, there may be huge in this picture. So if you look, there is a huge injury. So I have no such financial interest in such talk. Okay.
Dr. Das,
Just,
can you put
yeah,
your,
it's not moving. Yeah, not moving.
you need to put it in the slideshow mode, sir.
Yeah, slideshow. Okay. Just. Is it okay now? Yeah, fine. So I will not speak too much about that, but in adnexal injury, it may be orbital. Once it is involved the septum, it may involve not only the adnex purely, it may be with the eyeball, with the sinuses, sometimes with the intracranial, and almost the face, nose, all. So most of the time in complex trauma, we may need a team effort. But the primary importance is the assessment protocol. Some patient, of my few patients, they reported with a shock. That means it's unconscious patient sometimes. In a road traffic accident is almost 20-30% of patients are in an unconscious mode associated with head injury or without head injury also. The ocular examination and the ABC is the best. ABC is the ultimate. So whatever the injury, there may be other associated injuries. So we can look the all vitals, the nomenclature is airway, breathing and circulation. We should be very happy with those. Moment is there, then our part. Exactly the ophthalmology, ophthalmic. Rather in case of a ocular, I want to say is ophthalmic. The reason is that because our orbit is surrounded by sinuses and some other parts, intracranial. So we can look all visual acuity, optic nerve, retinal function, pupillary reactions, etc. We may not examine the fundus at that moment, but the pupil tells a lot. Is not only a signature of the cataract surgeon, it is a signature of the orbital and as well as neurophthalmy into the ophthalmology point of view. So in orbit as a whole, I will not, everyone knows, all are experts. So those are the points. I want to highlight exophthalmos. Is there any proptosis or palpation, or is there any some other disease? Because CCF may be one of the cause with adnexal injury sometimes. So those are the SARS, duration, mode of injury, site of injury, tissue loss, infection, margin, those. We can look all. And there may be some associated foreign body. It may be a metallic, it may be a non-metallic, or it may be with infection, without infection. So in metallic foreign body, one very important is that we should not go for MRI. Always we can think for only the CT scan. So in a bomb blast injuries or in a where the lower order situation is not as good as in such cases, there may be multiple foreign body palate in the orbit as well as in the brain. But patient is fully conscious, the no such reaction in the intracranial region. So in such cases, we can simply, if possible, we can remove the orbital foreign body and rest we can wait and watch. But sometimes it may be urgent evisceration. It is almost like an auto evisceration, huge bleeding, and there is the injury by some terrorist from a zero distance fire. So that's the reason. So it is whole eyeball is ruptured, whole orbit is totally ruptured. It is entered through the orbit and pass out above the ear. He is very lucky. He was not, and there is no such intracranial injury, gross injury, and ultimately that lead reconstruction with the orbital implant, and he is maintaining all. Some foreign bodies may looks like in a orbit in nexa, but be careful. Always we can look all those parameters, and those are actually intracranial injury associated with. Basically, those are a long wooden foreign body. Dry foreign body may penetrate up to the bone, up to the skull, and that's the happen. So in such cases, that's why the paramount necessities are the CT scan is mandatory. Vidya Shankar already mentioned. I will not go this canalicular, but there is a one issue for canalicular mini monoca. The cost is around 6.5 in government hospital, and sometimes is not easily available in all the cities or towns. In such cases, we can use a hand-found cannula. It is used very easily, though it is not so easy like a mini monoca or oro stent, but we can susar it nicely and we can do the justice for the patient. So in and Vidya Shankar cannot mention one point. What are the causes? Causes are blunt trauma, sharp trauma, motor vehicle, dog bite, and Dow's hook injury, one of the very common in case of a pediatric case. So assessment also the same as the before in any others. Detailed evaluation of source and the anesthesia. In case of pediatrics, so that is one is RBS and CSX is mandatory. Now it is as per the for 6 months. Okay. Protection of the globus injuries. One of our patient with a bullet injuries. There is a bullet inside, and once we removed it from it is nicely, all movements are come out. One patient and another interesting patient with a palate injury. That it is the one of the case of double block perforation. With it is foreign body was in the orbit. There is no need, just a later on we did some laser and remove the foreign body. Bomb blast injuries. As I already mentioned, those are there may be injuries associated with this is the some we remove it by transconjunctival injuries already mentioned. So there may be intracranial injuries. We should not think it is only adnexal injuries. So this is the surgical steps. So we can assess the land. So we can evaluate. This is a very long. So intracranial injuries. This is one of the patient, as I already told. I just faced so many patients with even in unconsciousness. This was I just received a call from a one multi-specialty hospital, and moment I opened, I was in shock. What is actually the injury? So that I just immediately called the ENT surgeons, and there was a, of course, in the emergency they did the X-rays. There's a fracture on the they concentrated morely on the initially in the hand, because hand was hanging. It was by that local doctor. It is close to stop the bleeding. Moment I opened in the OT, I was in very difficult stage, and then I just that fractured orbit was repaired with things, and my ENT colleagues just repaired the nose, and this is the ultimate thing. So I want to say the paramount is that thorough history, detailed examination, accurate localization if in the foreign bodies, and CT is the investigation. To summarize, the location, mode of injury, particularly use of quantitative CT is extremely helpful. Of course, to protection in case of other law and order situation, reforms of the law, and socio-economic development, and protective goggles for. Because now Diwali is coming, so there are lots of injuries in our countries. So in such scenario, my take-home message is to we can teach in the schools, children, etc. everywhere. So protective glass during the firecracker. If they want to enjoy the firecracker, some festival or whatever way. So prevention is always better. Thank you for all the members of MOS, all the moderators, everyone to give me the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Binda.
Dr. Preeti would be talking to us on some interesting cases. Dr. Preeti?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I'll just share my screen.
Yes.
Am
ma'am.
I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. You can share your screen.
Is my screen visible?
Yes.
It's visible,
Yeah,
right?
you need to make it full. That's all.
Yeah.
Yeah, good to go.
Okay. Very good afternoon to everyone. I would like to thank the MOS Scientific Committee and Dr. Ragini ma'am and Dr. Sumit Lahane sir for giving me this opportunity to have this presentation, and I'll be discussing about some interesting cases which are actually out of the box kind of oculoplasty cases. So let me start with my first case. So this was a baby, 1 day old, who was born out of a full-term normal vaginal delivery. As we can see, both his upper lid had ectropion. There was a lot of chemosis and congestion, as you can see. And when we tried to revert them back, in the right eye it was not possible, and in the left eye it was possible, but within few seconds it will revert back into ectropion position. So this attempts failed, and as the baby was crying, there was it kept on increasing. His systemic examination was completely normal. So when such kind of cases are encountered, there is lot of apprehension uh, on the part of the treating pediatrician and ophthalmologist. So, and we tend to think that there is some shortening of the lid or some structural problem, which will definitely go for some surgical intervention. But actually the treatment is a bit different. Even I was thinking ki, would this baby require tarsorrhaphy, but when I searched the literature, we came up with the diagnosis of the congenital upper lid ectropion, which is rarely reported, but may be common. So I searched for the pathology, what is causing this. So actually what happens, there is, when there is some inflammation around the lids, it can be due to vaginitis in the mother or something. So this causes orbicularis spasms. Okay, so during orbicularis spasm, what happens, the lid, the conjunctiva is strangulated at the lid margin, which causes a venous return obstruction. So the chemosis and congestion keeps on increasing, and it causes a vicious cycle to run. So it's difficult to treat. So based on this, we started on this treatment. Like we gave the baby 5% hypertonic saline hourly, and the 5% NaCl hypertonic saline bottles were used, and cotton gauzes were soaked in that, and we placed over the eyes constantly. Topical antibiotic and topical lubricants were also given. So I'll show the post-op results. So this is a rare condition, and I found in literature only 4 cases have been reported, and we recently reported our this case, and I'll show the photograph. This was at presentation, and after 4 to 5 days of conservative management, the eyelids were normal. So this kind of cases, if it is known to the pediatricians and the even general ophthalmologists, this will not go for unnecessary referral or unnecessary surgeries, and we can treat them conservatively. So I'll go ahead with the next case. In this patient, 40-year-old patient, he told me there is some swelling in the right eye, in the below the lower lid. So I asked where is the swelling. I could not appreciate externally. So he's told me, okay, when I look up, I can see the swelling. Even then, it was not possible. But as I reverted the lid, this swelling popped out. It was a well-defined circular, a kind of hard, but it was not adherent to tarsus or the skin. So we thought of it could be a dermoid or a sebaceous cyst or some kind of inclusion cyst. So we went ahead with the planned excision biopsy. So we gave a transconjunctival incision and we took out that lesion, but the attachment of that lesion were quite below. So we removed that mass in toto and we sent for a histopathology. So to our surprise, the histopathology came out to be a schwannoma or a neurilemoma. So there were Antony A and Antony B bodies. So which shows that there is this lesion has arisen from some nerve or its branch. So when we looked carefully at this photo, we can easily now see that it must have arisen from a infraorbital nerve itself or its branch. So we gave a diagnosis of schwannoma of infraorbital nerve. This condition is also a rare condition in which the tumor arises from the Schwann cells, and schwannomas of orbital nerves is also a rare condition. So when I saw there were only 10 cases of infraorbital nerve schwannoma in the literature, and the surgical excision, complete surgical excision is the surgery of choice. This is our third patient. So when this patient came, he came actually for the jaw swelling on the left side. So this is a 41-year-old patient. He had a painful swelling. Actually, he was at home, but when the pain started in that jaw area on the left side, he had this swelling since a month. And there were multiple black lesions. Okay, so but there was no family history. So looking upon this patient's photograph, what we saw, he has a different faces. There was a broad nasal bridge, and there were multiple lesions which were looked like rodent ulcers, pigmented rodent ulcers, and there was a jaw cyst. So we thought of a syndrome, that is Gordon-Gauss syndrome, which is a triad of basal cell carcinoma, jaw cyst, and bifid ribs. So we went ahead with some of the systemic investigations. We did a chest X-ray, and we got that there is a bifid rib on the right side. And also there was a jaw cyst which can be seen in this X-ray of the jaw. Plus there was a calcification of falx cerebri as well. So almost, and when we did the we did an incisional biopsy of a small lesion, and it also showed to be confirmatory of basal cell carcinoma. So finally, it fitted like all the major criteria, that is jaw cyst, basal cell carcinoma, and minor criteria, that is temporoparietal bruising, broad nasal bridge, bifid ribs, and calcification of falx cerebri. So this final diagnosis was made. We went ahead with surgery. A large, extensive, lid lesion was there. We took tarsoconjunctival flap from the upper lid, and posterior auricular skin graft was taken. This is a pre-operative period, and this is a post-operative photograph.
You can
So this
summarize.
is my last case. Yeah. So this is my last case. Actually, this girl, 19-year-old girl, presented with a left eye painful acute onset proptosis, around 1.5 to 2 months history she gave, and she was being treated at other center outside, and where she has been investigated and given almost 10 to 15 days of higher grade of all kind of antibiotics, suspecting it to be a orbital cellulitis. When she came, she had an axial proptosis with inferior dystopia, and there was exposure keratopathy. No.
Dr. Preeti, can you just summarize, please?
Yes, sir. So in this patient, what we did was this was a CT scan of this patient, and there was enhancing lesion in the extraocular muscle. So we thought of abdomyosarcoma, lymphoproliferative or pseudotumor. For this patient, actually, we went ahead with incisional biopsy. And to our surprise, the incisional biopsy came out to be we were thinking of a tumor, but it was an orbital inflammatory syndrome. And histopathologist told me that it looks like a Kimura's disease. And we did a IgE levels, which is raised in Kimura's disease. So, but histoimmunochemistry could not be done because of economic constraints. So we started her on oral steroids and cetirizine. So this is a at presentation, and this is after 2 weeks of post treatment. She is presently also on treatment. So this is my last case. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a wonderful case discussions and wonderful presentation. Thank you, Dr. Das. Thank you, Dr. Mariam. Thank you, Dr. Nupur and Dr. Preeti.
Thank
Thanks. Thank you.